Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our first virtual content share about California housing resources and housing rights. I'm Lauren Panaccio from Health Leads, an organization that runs both local and national projects that unearth and address the roots of racial inequity that impact the health of our communities. I'm based here in the Bay Area in California and lead our efforts to improve housing access and affordability. I'm joined today by Madeline Howard, a senior attorney from the Western Center on Law and Poverty, an organization that advocates for housing, healthcare, and a strong safety net for low-income Californians. Madeline, thanks so much for spending time with me today.
Thank you, Lauren. This is such an important topic, and I'm glad to be here. I'm hoping that this resource is going to be helpful for people out in the community dealing with this crisis.
Me too. And to Madeline's point, in today's discussion, we're going to focus on how California tenants can be protected from losing their housing during the coronavirus pandemic. We want to acknowledge that the policy landscape on this topic is changing every day. So we're going to do our best to share as much as we can at the time of recording, which is Thursday, March 26th at 9 a.m. PDT. We're so grateful to have Madeline here with us to help us make some sense of it all. Madeline, let's start by understanding the new shelter-in-place order that went into effect on March 18th across California. What does shelter-in-place mean?
Yeah, this has caused a lot of confusion. So the first thing is it means stay at home. If it's at all possible for you to work from home and conduct all of your activities from home, that's what you should do. But it does have an exception for essential activities. So that includes things like going to the grocery store, going to get your medicine, going for essential doctor's appointments, not routine type medical care. And it does allow for people to go outside and get exercise. And it also includes going to jobs that are considered essential, which is a broad category of things. On the California governor's website, there is a list of specific professions that are considered essential. Some of them are pretty obvious, like doctors and nurses, but there's also a lot of other categories, like people who work in communications, people who work at the grocery or at the pharmacy. So it's a really broad range of things that are considered essential. And those who have children and need to go to an essential job, it's also okay for them to have a babysitter come to their home for that purpose. But basically, use common sense, stay home if you can, and if you do need to go outside, you're supposed to stay at least 6 feet away from anyone else. One category I should highlight is that essential work includes people who are community health workers or public health workers, and also behavioral health workers, which means those who are serving people with mental health disabilities or substance abuse disorders. And we've also been advocating that people who do outreach to homeless individuals be included, because we want to make sure that during this crisis, people are still making it out to homeless encampments to do outreach and bring food and provide other services. But we haven't yet been successful on that.
That's so important, and grateful that your organization's doing that. To continue talking about shelter-in-place for a second, I'm wondering if you can share with us what happens if you're found to be in violation of shelter-in-place.
Yeah, so this is something that's going to be enforced by local law enforcement. So like many other things, this has really been varying from one community to another. We've seen some different approaches. I heard that in San Francisco, not a single ticket has been issued for violation of the order, whereas in San Jose, they were taking a little bit more of an aggressive approach. And a lot of businesses had been approached for violating, for staying open, even though they're not essential businesses. So we're going to see some really varying approaches. And so it's kind of hard for me to give more guidance than that. I also want to flag something here. I think whenever we see increased presence of law enforcement, we need to think about race equity issues. Just like we saw with sort of stop and frisk policies where Black and brown people were really targeted. I want people to really be on the lookout for the disparate impact of these types of policies, and for law enforcement being directed more towards communities of color for alleged violations of this policy. And unfortunately, like every other type of crisis or natural disaster, the pandemic is going to impact communities of color more heavily. There's just people are going to be hurt more. And if you look at, for example, the homeless population, Black people are heavily overrepresented among homeless people, and this pandemic is going to hurt that community the most. So that's just something to really be aware of.
That's such a critical point, Madeline, and brings up the reality that this pandemic is exacerbating the inequities that have been baked into our systems for a long time. Those don't suddenly go away in this crisis. They unfortunately get amplified, which is an unfortunate, helpful segue to a discussion about housing. California was already experiencing a housing crisis before this pandemic, and to your point, Madeline, one that foremost impacted communities of color. And now, as a consequence of the shelter-in-place order, many renters in our communities may be even more unable to earn wages and thus even more at risk of eviction. And while California state and local governments are beginning to address how to protect tenants from losing housing during the coronavirus pandemic, it's been really hard to track and candidly confusing. So I'm hoping you can help us out. Before we get started on understanding the protections that are in place, I'm wondering if you could just walk us through the basics of an evictions process.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're pulling up the graphic that we put together to explain this better, I just really want to highlight again the racial inequities that are already inherent in our system. We know that Black women are more likely to experience eviction than any other group already, that people of color are more likely to be rent burdened or severely rent burdened and paying more than 50% of their income for rent. So obviously this group is going to be much more likely to be at risk of losing their housing when we have this situation of so many people losing their income. So going to your question about the eviction process, this graphic is an effort to do a very simplified version of the process, but also highlight which parts of the process involve going to a courthouse, which is a time that you don't want to do that during this process, right? Everyone's supposed to be sheltering in place. No one should be going to a crowded courthouse and being exposed to illness. So let's go through each of the steps here. So the first step in any eviction is that the landlord is going to give a written notice to the tenant. I'm going to focus on the most common type, which is a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. And that's obviously a very short time period. So the landlord will give a notice to the tenant if they don't pay their rent on time and say you have 3 days to pay this balance. And if the tenant does not pay, then the landlord can go to court and file what's called an unlawful detainer case. That's just a fancy name for an eviction case. And then the tenant needs to respond or else they automatically will lose. So all of these steps involve someone going to court, and in this climate, they're being exposed to illness. They're having to touch doors and papers and other things that others have touched and do all the things that we're not supposed to be doing right now. So assuming that the tenant is able to respond, there'll then be a series of hearings and a trial to determine what's going to happen. And some courts are allowing people to conduct all of these proceedings over the phone or through electronically filing papers through the internet. But unfortunately, many of our low-income community members don't really have access to that technology, so would have no choice but to actually go to court. And even legal aid programs that provide legal services to low-income people, many of them are now closing their doors and only providing services over the phone. So that's sort of making access even harder, and again, forcing people to actually have to go into the court to defend their housing. So after going through this court process, if the landlord wins, then the landlord gets a judgment which says that they get to have the tenant leave the house. And the only person that can actually enforce that judgment and remove the tenant from their home is the sheriff. So once there is a judgment against the tenant, the sheriff goes to the tenant's home and puts a notice on the door, usually gives them 5 days before they actually will be removed from the house, and then ultimately the sheriff will lock the tenant out. So that is the process, and hopefully this will be a helpful foundation for us understanding all these different responses.
It's really helpful, and it's already a pretty complicated process. So let's layer on those extra protections that are starting to be put into place, and start with the governor's executive order, which put protections for tenants from being evicted during the coronavirus pandemic. I'm wondering if you can help us understand what exactly that order does as it relates to this eviction process.
Yeah, I think the governor's order has actually caused quite a bit of confusion, and we have a visual here for where that kind of interacts with this process. Unfortunately, the governor's order doesn't actually do anything to stop evictions. What it does is it says, local governments, if you want to, you can protect tenants in this very specific way, which is to say that tenants who cannot pay because of COVID should not be evicted. So this is limited in a lot of ways. One of them is it requires local governments to act. And as of the last time I checked, of the 500 or so local governments in California, only about 50 had enacted any of these protections. And I know many of these local bodies, boards of supervisors and city councils, they are no longer meeting because of the shelter-in-place order. And so it's very hard for them to take these actions. And the second problem is that this is really limited in terms of the types of evictions that it would stop and where it stops them. So even if it's very clear that a tenant cannot pay because of COVID, maybe they got a letter from their boss. I think this is going to be very rare, but say they got a letter from their boss saying, you are fired, your job is over because of the virus. They could show that to their landlord, but they would still have to go to court and prove that they cannot pay because of the virus. So we still have this problem of people going into court and being exposed to the illness. In addition, this doesn't even say that local governments could stop other types of evictions. For example, maybe the tenant is subletting their room or they have a dog or a cat and they're not supposed to. The landlord could still go and file an eviction based on something like that, which just really doesn't make sense in this current climate. So unfortunately, that executive order didn't really go very far towards protecting tenants.
It sounds like there's a few pieces of that make it, unfortunately, not as strong as it can be. You have to opt in at the local government level, which is challenging given the shelter in place. You need folks to go in person to court, which is antithetical to the shelter in place. And even after that, to have a chance, you have to have documentation that the reason you can't afford your rent is because of coronavirus. And in this moment when healthcare workers and frontline staff are working so hard to just treat people, I can't imagine documentation for those who can't afford their rent is high in their list. So appreciate your walking through that and helping us understand all the limitations there. There's also been discussion about closing the courts or having sheriff's offices stop processing evictions. And I'm hoping you can help us understand how that affords protections in this moment.
Yeah, let's look at that. So some of the court orders have been more helpful. We've seen some counties, including Alameda County, treat all of the days up until early April as court holidays, which means that nobody is filing documents, nobody is having to go to court, and no one is being exposed to the virus by having to go to a crowded courthouse. So this has been a more helpful response. It's more just stopping things. No one's going to file unlawful detainer complaints and no one has to defend them. So that's been a helpful response. Unfortunately, only a few counties have done that, and most counties are still doing more. They are having some trials. They are still having people file papers. And we've seen guidance, or we've seen a court order from the Chief Justice of the California courts saying that jury trials are suspended for the next 60 days. But unfortunately, that order does not stop anything else. So other types of trials and filings and other things in court are still going forward. So this is really varying a lot from county to county in terms of how much the courts are operating.
And what about the sheriff's office piece of this? How does that protect tenants?
Yeah, so the sheriff's process, as I mentioned, that happens at the very end. The sheriff is the one who actually physically removes someone from their home. And this is, again, I'm going to keep saying this, it's really varying at the local level. We have several sheriff's departments that are saying we are not going to enforce writs of possession. We are not taking anyone out of their home, and that's really helpful. We don't want anyone to be losing their housing at this point. But unfortunately, that's very late on in the process. So that would mean that everyone had already had to go to court and be exposed to the illness and sort of go through this whole process that we want to really stop at the very beginning. And unfortunately, it's only a few sheriff's departments that are stopping evictions. And we've been advocating with our partners for all sheriff's departments to stop evictions. And we're hoping that we're successful in that because, again, just all of the harms of homelessness and of losing your housing are tremendously exacerbated in this context.
That's so helpful. Thanks, Madeline, for walking us through that all. It makes a lot of sense, and it also makes not a lot of sense because of how confusing it is. And to that point, it seems like the hard part now is understanding if you live in a place where any of these protections are in place. So I'm wondering how folks can learn if where they live affords any of the protections we just walked through.
Yeah, it can be very confusing to figure this out. So there's sort of two places that you want to look. As I mentioned, there's local governments are passing some protections, and then local courts are doing different things with closing or sort of partially closing. So you can look at your county's court website. Each county has a superior court, and that's where the eviction cases go through. So looking at your county court's website for the superior court, most of the courts are putting this in a banner right at the top of the website, so it's easy to find. And that should give you some information about what's happening. I'm sorry to say that a lot of the orders are quite confusing, so please contact an attorney if you're facing an eviction notice, but look at the court website. And then the other place to look is at your local government, and this can be the county and also the city that you live in, because local governments have been doing some limited protections, saying that people who lost income because of COVID should be protected from eviction, and that's where you're going to find those protections, is on the county or the city website. So those are the places to check.
Great, thanks so much. Now, so let's say that I now understand, based upon your guidance, if I have any of these protections afforded to me based upon where I live. Let's say I'm also at risk of eviction. I'm wondering what you'd recommend folks do to be prepared to apply the protections that are in place.
Yeah, if you have received a written eviction notice from your landlord, please right away seek assistance from an attorney. Most communities have a local legal services office, which you can find on the internet. And for example, here in the Bay Area, we have Bay Area Legal Aid and also East Bay Community Law Center. And many offices right now, they are closed to in-person visits, but they are still operating on the phone. So for example, I know with Bay Area Legal Aid, you can still call their legal advice line because you really need to talk to an attorney if you've gotten an eviction notice. So that is the first thing. If you have lost income because of COVID and there is any way that you can document that, then that is going to be helpful to you. I know that most businesses are probably not going to send a letter or any written communication specifically stating this is because of COVID, but if it's possible for you to get something like that, that would be helpful. And again, I know that our healthcare systems are completely overwhelmed, but if it is possible to get any kind of documentation related to any health reason, that you're not able to pay your rent or meet other obligations of your tenancy, that's going to be helpful as well. We've also heard that some landlord groups are encouraging landlords not to evict people during this crisis. We're grateful that that advice is being given. It's also a good idea to talk to your landlord and try to get them to make a reasonable choice. But unfortunately, unless you have something in writing, you really can't rely on those types of conversations to avoid eviction. So I'm sorry that I don't have anything more helpful to say on that. It's a really tough situation. We are also hoping that there'll be more rental assistance resources available, but again, that's a local thing, and so I can't really point to a centralized place that people can look for rental assistance.
It's helpful to know how to analyze the situation. And again, we want to continue to acknowledge we're recording this today, Thursday, March 26th at 9 a.m. And we sincerely hope all of this is out of date very soon because we want some stronger protections in place. So we've been spending a lot of time on renters, and that makes a lot of sense, but all of the things that put renters at risk of not being able to afford their rent can similarly put landlords or homeowners of any kind at risk for not affording their mortgages. And so I'm wondering, Madeline, if you can spend just a minute on sharing any protections that may be in place for those homeowners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've often seen that homeowners just get more attention from policymakers. So we're thinking that we are going to see a lot of relief packages coming down to help homeowners. We hope that those will also be happening for renters. A few highlights on things that we've seen so far. On the federal level, HUD has announced that they will not be going through any foreclosure or eviction processes for those people who have mortgages insured by Fannie Mae. So that's just a very limited group, but still helpful. The governor also announced yesterday that he had secured agreement from several major banks that they would not be penalizing people who could not pay their mortgages for the next 90 days if it was related to COVID. So some limited stuff so far. I think we're going to see a lot more in that department. And I'm hoping, again, that those protections will be extended to renters as well, because the renters are much more vulnerable in the end. And there's larger numbers of people of color who are renters, and it's just a much more vulnerable community.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there is a relationship between renters affording their rent and homeowners affording their mortgage. So there's a relationship there. And yes, we know that renters are more vulnerable and to your point, sometimes overlooked, so or not as highly protected. So again, we hope that this is out of date very soon, because we want to see some stronger protections. We've been talking a lot about our community members that are housed, but I want to turn our attention to those that unfortunately aren't housed in this moment. First off, at baseline, we know that access to housing drives positive health outcomes, and conversely, that lack of housing can contribute to some serious health implications. That seems to be even more true in this outbreak with a virus that is so highly contagious. And just last week, the United Nations named housing, quote, the frontline defense against the COVID-19 outbreak. And so it's hard for me to not think about our unsheltered neighbors and community members in this moment. Madeline, I'm wondering if you can share what protections might be in place for our unsheltered neighbors in this moment.
Yeah, we are extremely concerned about people experiencing homelessness right now. We are already in a crisis, as you mentioned. This is already a really difficult situation, and it's just very, very scary what these communities are being subject to now that we have this virus. So a few things. People already have the right, people experiencing homelessness already have the right to stay where they are if there is not adequate shelter that's appropriate for their needs. So that is sort of existing law. So people who are homeless cannot be forced from the place that they are staying and forced into shelter that's not appropriate. Now, what appropriate means is kind of different, because it's not appropriate for anyone to be in a congregate shelter where they're sharing a large room and sleeping with lots of people very close together. That is not going to serve anyone's interest. And so people do have the right to stay where they are. And what we're hoping is that we can get protections for outreach workers so that we can continue to have people be provided with food services, health services, and hopefully more sanitary services and things like restroom facilities and hand sanitizer and all these types of things to make the current encampment situation a little bit safer. And the state has thankfully provided a pot of money to help so that people who are currently homeless can be put up in hotels and motels and trailers and other types of housing that is not shared. And so we're hoping that local governments will be able to get that money out and really get a lot of people into shelter.
Yeah, again, our continued hope that the state of affairs changes rapidly around us as we think about our community's health. Madeline, right now, with the situation as it currently is, I'm hoping you can just remind us of the rights our homeless neighbors have in this moment and how they might be able to exercise these rights if or when they need to.
Yeah, so we have been really concerned that some local governments will take this pandemic as an excuse to sort of clear encampments and kick people out of where they're staying. And we're really grateful that we've seen some great guidance from the Center for Disease Control saying that encampments should not be cleared unless there is alternative housing that is safe in this current situation, meaning something more like a motel, a hotel, or just housing, just any kind of housing that is not a congregate shelter. So that guidance has been really helpful. So local government should not be clearing encampments, should not be forcing people from where they're staying unless there's an actual appropriate place for them to stay. We've also asked for the governor to clarify that the shelter-in-place order does not apply to people who are unhoused. And we think that's really important, again, to prevent these really harmful actions that might be taken.
So helpful, and again, so grateful for the work that you and Western Center continues to do to try to advance the protections that are in place. And with that, Madeline, I'm wondering if you can share with us what specific protections we can all be advocating for in this moment as we continue to acknowledge the policies that are in place just don't do the job of keeping our communities healthy and housed.
Yeah, so we are grateful to have so many partners that are working on this advocacy together. Some of the things I've mentioned, advocating for homeless individuals to make sure that they are not forced out of the place that they are staying without an appropriate and safe alternative place to stay. In terms of evictions, we want to see a full stop of evictions other than those that are absolutely necessary to address an imminent threat to someone's safety. So we want to see a stop where no one is having to go to court. And we are also hoping for long-term solutions so that both homeowners and tenants will not, in 3 or 4 months when we're hopefully out of the situation, will not have a giant accrued balance that they then have to pay or face losing their housing, because it won't serve anyone's interest for people to face displacement now or in a few months when this is over. So we're hoping to see that kind of long-term relief, as well as in the immediate moment, a stop to eviction.
Thanks so much, Madeline, for walking us through all of that. We hope that that was helpful to folks. And again, we know that it was a lot. And as we continue to mention, these policies are evolving, and we can sincerely hope that they evolve well past where we are currently, Thursday, March 26th, 9 a.m. PDT. We want to leave you with a few resources to help you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in your communities and the ways in which you can, to Madeline's point, can help us continue to advocate for better protections in place. So first off, to Madeline and our shared point, we are fortunate to not be in this work alone. There are two great organizations, Tenants Together, East Bay Housing Organization, and others that are helping us keep the finger on the evolving policy. On the screen, you'll see the websites for both Tenants Together and EBHO, and how to navigate to their COVID-19 resources, which again are live updates on what policies are in place, again, at the city, county, and state level. These are great first resources to understand what's going on. To Madeline's point earlier as well, you can always access government websites at the city, county, or state level. And we've got some examples on the screen here. As you can see, their coronavirus updates are very prominent. They're usually a banner or a big call out on the home page. So it's pretty easy to find these government websites. It can be a little hard to navigate the details of them, I will admit. But they are also there, and they will help you understand what is in place in your community. But to our continued penchant, what's in place just isn't enough right now. And so we want to leave you with some resources where you can lend your voice as a community member to try to join Health League's Western Center on Law and Poverty and other organizations in asking for more protections. So first and foremost, there are petitions that all you have to do is type your name and sign. On the screen here, you'll see the website for, again, Tenants Together. They're such a leader in this space right now. Very easy to click on that petition. It's right on their homepage and sign it. Very similarly, Housing Now, the specific petition website is on the screen, has a similar petition. All you have to do is sign it. It's pretty easy to get the job done and continue to put pressure on our officials to do better. To that point, you can always reach out to your government officials. We know that this works. All of their contact information is only a Google away. It's all very accessible. I've thrown the governors up here just in case you want to feel compelled to call the governor right now and make the demands. You can read pieces of the petitions that we just mentioned earlier to ask for deeper protections. And again, you can advocate at your city level, the county level, state, and at the governor's office. Really cool in this blue box here, this URL, which I know is a little funky, I have to type it just as it is, but this is what we call a contact bot. And what the contact bot does is in a streamlined place, and it really does only take it 5 minutes, it does its job well. You can email the governor, you can put pressure on your local officials through social media, and it'll even help you find your local legislators, their phone numbers, and make a phone call all through that one website. And that was stood up by our friends at Housing is a Human Right. So lots of resources out there to help folks take action so we can, again, hopefully make everything we just shared obsolete, and there's some better protections that are in place. I want to end with just a big sigh and the sincerest thank you. That was a lot to walk through. And Madeline, thank you so much for making it a bit more understandable for all of us who aren't lawyers, myself included. We're so thankful for everybody who's watching, who's tuning in. And thank you for just staying engaged in this conversation. Our final ask is, again, please take some sort of action, whether it be signing a petition, calling your legislator, sharing this video with people in your community. There's a lot of information to share. There's lots of ways we can use our voices, and we hope that we've helped you do those things. For any questions or comments, you can always contact me, Lauren, and my team at HealthPlace at the email on your screen now. We're happy to answer any questions to the best of our ability. And again, a final thanks to you, Madeline, and to Western Center on Law and Poverty for being such good advocates and partners in this work. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay engaged. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.